Welcome to Talk Back. I am Yechury. Over the next 13 weeks, we are going to be discussing a number of issues related to the World Trade Organization or the WTO. We will be talking to policymakers, economists, industrialists and others to demystify the issues surrounding the WTO. Let us first take an
among member nations. India is a founding member of the WTO. Today there are 157 members, and 9 more countries are signing on.
The WTO may mean different things to different people, but one thing is for sure. It is going to affect every aspect of international commerce: goods, services, ideas, designs, inventions, investments, and a host of other areas. In order to see how, let us turn to our first panel. With me on the panel here today, I have Mr. P. Chidambaram, former Commerce Minister and Finance Minister of India and an eminent lawyer. Welcome, Mr. Chidambaram.
Thank you.
And we also have on the panel Mr. Yechury, a highly respected member of the CPI-M. Greetings. Now, as we talk about the WTO, one approach that one hears is that WTO is there to stay, so we might as well learn to live with it. But if we had a choice, is India better off with the WTO than without, Mr. Chidambaram?
Without doubt. Why would anyone wish to withdraw from the WTO, even as, say, China is knocking on the doors of WTO to become a member? I think it would be quite short-sighted and foolish to even talk in terms of withdrawal from WTO. What we must try to do is to try to maximize the gains of being a member of the WTO.
But why so much apprehension and fear about the WTO?
Ignorance, I suppose.
Mr. Yechury.
Well, I wouldn't say it's only ignorance. You see, the point is nobody here is arguing that you be out of WTO. The question is, in what terms have you entered the WTO? I mean, we had this prolonged negotiations that went through the entire year go-round. Went almost a decade long of, and India was consistently taking a position, let's say, up to 88, 89, when it was talking about saying that the GATT should not, or any international organization comes up, should not talk in terms of anything other than trade in goods. Then we changed our position, and what has gone into that? You see, the point at issue is in what terms are we entering the WTO? Now, are they useful for us? I mean, that is what we have to evaluate.
Yeah, you mentioned the fact that originally GATT was all about trade in goods, and now we've extended it to services. Now, I would have thought that services is the big thing that is happening in world trade, and that is an area in which India has tremendous strength. So do you think it is to our disadvantage that services have been brought in to the WTO?
No, not at all. India's GDP today comprises almost 47% of services. Most GDPs of most countries, a very large proportion of services. It may be that we had a comparative advantage at one point of time in, say, some segments of agriculture, in some segments of industry, but surely India has and will have a comparative advantage in many, many services. Therefore, what's the point? If the bulk of your GDP is in services, why should you not have services as part of the global trading system and try to maximize your comparative advantages? It springs from a complex that we cannot be competitive. We cannot have a comparative advantage, and that I stoutly refute.
Mr. Yechury, if we look at the success of the software industry in India, would you not say that that is a prime example of what Mr. Chidambaram is saying?
My dispute or my complaint is not that it's been extended to services. Well, it's been extended to many other areas other than services. You have intellectual property rights. I mean, you have the whole area now being talked about, the social clause. You have
services.
No, services is something that's bound to happen. You know, but when the world was at the stage when that was formed, and the world of today, at that point of time, services contribution to the world's GDP, let's say, was much, much less than what it is today. So it is only a natural corollary. So it's got nothing to do in terms of actually a fear that we won't have a comparative advantage.
So we should be happy. We have some under the WTO.
The point is not being happy or unhappy. The point is that when they are done, what terms are they integrating? Yes, and our complaint is there, Mr. Chidambaram. You see, you have the MFA. Let's say multi-fiber agreement. Now, why do we have to withdraw our quantitative restrictions before that is phased out? It's a simple give and take. Why do we have to succumb to that?
I can answer that.
Yes, please.
There are two separate issues. You see, MFA, as far as Indian exporters are concerned, one half think MFA is the only way they've been able to penetrate world markets. The other half thinks MFA is a barrier, it caps their capacity to export. So I think the view on MFA is divided. We wanted the MFA to be abolished. When the vote took place, only Pakistan stood up with us and voted in favor of abolishing MFA. We traded off the MFA in systems of importing countries with intellectual property. We wanted a 10-year phase-over for intellectual property. They got a 10-year phase-over for MFA. I don't think we should make up quantitative restrictions. Quantitative restrictions come from another clause, which is your BOP.
I just want to clarify that we've been talking about the multi-fiber agreement on textiles, and your point is that that agreement is backloaded, where the developed countries have restrictions on imports from developing countries, including India. And what Mr. Chidambaram is saying is that we conceded on that in order to get something on the intellectual property rights. We gained more time.
Let's not accept that was an equitable concession. I don't agree that it was equitable at all. On the contrary, I don't also agree that there's a divided house as far as the MFX is concerned. The point today internationally, if you look at it, you will see not only India, whether it's Pakistan or Bangladesh, for example, which is most affected by the MFA. These restrictions, which it is not a technicality in terms of which area they fall in, but these are quantitative restrictions. MFA is a quantitative restriction.
I would like to put another question. I concede that, yes, in this respect, the developed countries have done, they have not kept up the spirit of the agreement, and they have not reduced their barriers for imports from developing countries. But do you really think that if the MFA were to go today, that Indian textile industry is ready to compete with China, Bangladesh? So you see, we have to do a lot more work at home. We can't, I agree with you that this is a problem area, but we also need to do much more at home to improve our competitiveness.
We are not using this period. We are not using this period usefully.
You mentioned intellectual property. I think that is another area where there is a lot of apprehension that if you have you do have the new intellectual property regime now. What this is going to do is that the essential medicines are not going to be affordable since the patented drugs are going to come into the market, and there are two views on this. So I would just like to get first your views and then yours.
Another popular myth and a widely held erroneous belief. The World Health Organization has identified only about 250 drugs or so which are required for mankind. For every drug that comes on patent, there will be a drug which goes off patent. You can manufacture off-patent drugs. The on-patent drugs you can manufacture, people will manufacture here. And if they do not manufacture, there are enough safeguards both in the WTO agreement, and we have written more safeguards into our patent law for compulsory licensing, for non-commercial public use. If you want to strengthen your patent law consistent with Article 17 of the WTO, you can do that. But to say that Indians will not invent or make molecules which can lead to new drugs is again stems from a complex which I called earlier is wrong. We can make new medicines, we can enter the market. In fact, Rabies laboratories are on the verge of entering the market in a breakthrough molecule.
You can't reduce everything to psychological complexes, or a complexity. Give them the R&D, in the absence of investing, look at your drug prices today. Let's not talk in terms of abstract theory. Just go down to the market to look at them. And it's again a myth, well, to use your own expression. It's a myth actually to think that all patented drugs can be produced in the country, because drugs are not something static. They actually grow over a period of time when new strains of diseases come. And you cannot really treat the new strains of diseases with old drugs, which are out of patent. So it's not a question of availability. At what price? Control? Price control. No, it's like a class 10, let's say a school football team and a class 2 football team play on equal rules and say they let the best win. No, that is what the WTO regime.
How have scientists done well in space research, in rocketry, in metallurgy? If you've done well there, why can't you do well in other areas?
It's not the question of questioning the competency of your scientific mind. I mean, I think we have the best in the world. But the question is translating that competency into a production process. That's not a domestic issue. No, that is a domestic issue. That domestic issue, when you are weak, what terms will you enter onto an international agreement? That is my point. That is why I draw the analogy. That is a class 10 team and a class 2 team. You enter and play the game.
It's still a class 10 team and a class 10 team. One class 10 team has good shoes, good equipment, good trainer. The other class 10 team does not have shoes, equipment, and trainer. Find the trainer, find equipment. Don't say class 10.
But let me ask you, another major apprehension on the WTO is about food security. You know, there is this fear that all hell will break loose if you have trade liberalization in agriculture, and food prices will increase, and our poor will not be able to afford this food. What is meant by food security, and what is your view on that? Do you think we suffer in terms of food security?
Food security, my definition would be not only adequate production of food, but also the capacity for people to lift that production and to sustain their livelihood. Now, this is something connected not only with the economic production aspect of it, it's also not a distributive aspect of it, which is nothing wrong with any international organization. It's our business at home.
We have to decide that.
Now the question at the moment, what you are asked is that removing quantitative restrictions in agriculture. Now this is going to, in my opinion, have a very adverse effect on Indian agriculture, and particularly your peasantry. And the results of it are beginning to be seen already. I mean, since you have been, you take the instance of, let's say, coconut today in Kerala. You take the question of, I mean, this is not part of the QRs, but I mean, once you put sugar in Yechury, you look at your sugar cane and the sugar is selling the commercial.
Look at individual crops, no? You should look at agriculture potential as a whole.
If you look at
The question I ask you is that if the European countries are forced to reduce their subsidies to their agriculture, is it not true that our agriculture will be more competitive and we can exploit that potential?
I think this is where one of the biggest lopsided myths about the WTO is there. You are told that your subsidies cannot cost 10%. They are told that they have to reduce their existing subsidies by 20%. In the USA, for example, by their own calculations, from 84 they will come down to 64%, but you cannot cost 10%. So what competitiveness are we talking about? I mean, let us be honest with ourselves. I mean, in the documents, I mean,
Do we have competitiveness in agriculture or not?
I think we're sitting today on a mountain of sugar, on a mountain of wheat, a mountain of rice. Do we have food security? By going by Mr. Yechury's definition, we do not have food security because we don't know how to distribute it. Take, for example, the mindless increase in the PDS prices and the withdrawal of 35 paise. I think it's a complete policy distortion. Be that as it may. No, I didn't. The US government did reduce PDS prices because that's the way to assure food security. But I think our agriculturists deserve and need world prices. If you, I don't think there can be any argument that your farmer deserves to get world prices. If you want your consumer to get food at lower prices because many of them are below the poverty line, that is a separate issue. You don't load it on the farmer. You take it on the state exchequer and take the subsidy on the state budget and say, I will provide food at a cheaper price. But don't deprive your farmer of world prices. Today we can export sugar. Now, what is the need for any quantitative restriction there? If you want to do anything, you can do it by tariff adjustments. Raise the tariff, lower the tariff in order to take care of changing situations. But if you have a long-term policy where you give your farmer world prices, our farmers will produce enough for ourselves, subject to our ability to distribute it, and feed half the world. Over a period of time, in the next 10 years, less than 1% of Europe, 1% of America is going to be engaged in food production. You will be able to export to many countries of the world. I think we are caught in a net of our own fears. These fears will go once you open up. The tariff mechanism is adequate and effective to take care of any aberrations, any shocks.
We have agricultural experts going into this question of where does our comparative advantage lie, and this is very good, but I do want to move on to some other issues which are also very emotional, and one of those is this whole question of the removal of QRs on industrial products. And April 2000, as you know, we have more than 700 items on which quantitative restrictions on imports will go. And the small-scale sector is up in arms, saying they will be wiped out. What is the government doing to prepare industry to face this competition? Do we have a choice? Should we, give them very high protection at this rate? What should we do?
Well, I think a degree of protection must be given. But the numbers that are being talked about, I think, are terrible numbers. We can't talk about 80% protection and 60% protection. Yes, in some areas you might want to protect them up to about 30% or even 35%. In very critical areas where you require a slightly longer period of adjustment, you can go up to 40%. If you tell industry, this is the protection, this is the phase-out period, I believe industry will adjust itself. Industry in India has become more competitive in the last 7 years. There's no gainsaying that. Every segment of India's industry has become leaner, has become more competitive, shed fat, and certainly will become more competitive in future.
Share your optimism, actually. I've got a fundamental problem here, you see. The GATT tells you that if you have a DOP problem, you can take recourse to this and maintain the QRs. Now, our government's problem is, since you've been tom-tomming, but we've got about 30 now, how much is it? 36 $36 billion of foreign exchange reserves. So it looks patently ridiculous in the world to say that you have this DOP problem. But look at it, I think a serious mistake is being committed by the country and the policymakers. Out of this so-called foreign exchange reserve, everybody admits today, much of it, or the bulk of it, is what your hot money is about, and which is something that you really cannot use it. Yes, I mean, and if it is no, then I would like to know what is the government doing. Is it a miser storing this money? If it's something that can use it, then why don't you use it? Why don't you invest it? The fact that you are not able to touch it and just remains there is something because you dare not touch it because of the flow problems and the hot money that it is. Now, I them to argue.
Smaller reserves and then keep what you are.
No, why smaller reserves? I'm saying invoke your BOP clause. The WTO doesn't talk of your reserves. It talks of the BOP problem.
Foreign exchange is a flow. And if you look at the flows, your Foreign Exchange Regulation Act, your CPI regime, your anti-liberal economic stance led you to a situation where you came down to a level of $1 billion of foreign exchange. Opening up exports and imports, opening up investments, FII, FDI, has given you today $36 billion US. Believe me, in '96, when the US took over, we had about, I think, $18 billion. We added $9 billion in those 2 years. Since then, the government has added. Every time the prophets of doom have said that our reserves will vanish, every year we're adding $3 billion and $4 billion. Believe me, in the next 4 or 5 years, our reserves will touch $50 billion. And 10 years, the reserves can easily touch $100 billion.
And then what happens?
We don't have a BOP problem, that's all I'm
saying. Figures, but your figures that you dish out to the country.
It has a
as a flow.
But Mr. Yechury,
that flow not being used.
But tell me,
we're making it available for imports, we're making it available for travel, we're making it available for foreign investment.
tell me, how long will you protect inefficiency in this manner?
I don't buy this factor of inefficiency. You see, I mean, what is efficiency and efficiency? Ultimately, what is it subjective for? I mean, what do you want to
Why should I, as a consumer, be paying 3 times as much for a product because you, as government, say that I will not allow an imported commodity to be bought at 1/3 the price? You must buy from a domestic producer, and that too a small-scale producer.
Because to invoke your right, we are in fact creating problems for many other people who are there in the production process.
You are talking about the workers in the production process. How about so many who are unemployed who cannot participate in the production process because you won't let them grow with these policies?
I'm not talking of the workers alone. I'm talking of the people in our country.
The people in this country are not willing anymore to be told that you cannot buy
elementary logic is elementary logic that if you are going to close down production here of some units saying it's more efficient to import it, the jobs are being lost here.
No, jobs will move to other more dynamic.
Which are
there are some is doing very well. Is doing
Can I say something?
No, I think it is one fallacy. If I can point it, gems and jewelry, everybody keeps talking about doing very well. Gems and jewelry is also the largest import bulk here, and then it's
It gives you jobs.
But your net exporter, is the governments. On which there are restrictions. I mean,
if you tell me there is this segment where there is a danger that by removing QRs, jobs will be lost, that's a valid argument. If I had anything to do with government, would certainly give them a measure of protection that they deserve for a period of time that they need. That has nothing to do with the fundamental argument that Indian industry has become more competitive and will become more competitive only when you abolish the QR regime and replace it by a tariff regime. Our government, the previous government, the present government, all our domestic policy failures are being loaded on the WTO. Let's recognize that domestic policy failures cannot be palmed off in the WTO. Take the WTO regime, make your domestic policy good and efficient. If you can't have a good domestic policy, why blame the WTO?
Now, I think I would like to move to the real problem area of the WTO, which is the social clause. The question of labor standards, imposition of environmental standards on developing countries, which are perceived by many as really non-tariff barriers that the developed countries are imposing so that we cannot remain as competitive as we would otherwise. And there again, the question is, do we fight from within Or, what option do we have? What would be your view on this linking of labor standards with trade?
You see, the majority view in this country is that labor standards and environmental standards ought not to be linked to WTO. But there is an articulate minority which passionately argues among trade unionists, among environmentalists, that unless there is some kind of pressure, international external pressure, we will never measure up to good environmental standards and labor standards. I don't think we can resolve that debate here. All right, we can put off the day when WTO will interfere in these matters. But you'll have to face these issues in the ILO. You have to face these issues in other fora. I think the best is to use this time, to buy this time in order to prepare this country to move to labor standards and environmental standards which are acceptable, which are humane. You cannot have subnormal labor standards, subnormal environmental standards, and yet tell the world, it's not your business to poke your nose. We will not reform, and you will not tell us what to do. Why don't you have a good policy where your standards in labor and environment will become acceptable to the rest of the world and even to your own people?
It's a noble thought. I mean, there cannot be any dispute on that. But the point is on the practical aspect of it. You see, the entire question is that yes, we want child labor abolished. I mean, that's one of the important things that we want the environmental standards to be made. But that is where the link up between saying that we cannot blame the WTO for what we cannot do internally. The point is that things we are not able to do it internally. Do we accept those? If you do that, then there is also the other day. Look at the other point of a large number of people losing their jobs as a result of accepting these clauses. So why do we dispute the domestically and you have to clean this up? And that is something all of us would want and all of us have been asking for and striving for. But the question is, in the real world, accepting these clauses, what impact will it have on you? And that would be a negative and adverse impact, socially and economically, as far as India is concerned.
No, but I think the point that Mr. Chidambaram is making is, he is also recognizing that, but he is saying we should use the time by
some amount of pressure from outside. Maybe not foreign pressure, it's hopeful from inside.
So would it be fair to say then that we all agree that India is better off being a part of the multilateral trading regime?
But I think that's the question.
What we need to do really is to use our economic power and all our negotiating skills to get the best out of the system.
I think we are now part of a more complex, more demanding world. What we need is to upgrade our own skills to deal with this world. There's no point taking an ostrich-like attitude. Our own incompetence, our own domestic failures cannot be loaded in the WTO.
I'll paraphrase it a little differently. I mean, the point is nobody today can argue. I mean, nobody can argue to either insulate or isolate India from the rest of it. I mean, that's a ridiculous position. But the position is on what terms will this integration be possible? And those terms we must get the best out of it.
Absolutely.
And for that we have to work. And our complaint has been that more often than not, you're not been getting it. That we can debate. But we have to, this is the perspective with which this integration with the world economy, whether WTO or any other aspect of it, will have to be made.
Yeah, thank you. We are all agreed then that India must become an active member of the WTO. We must use our economic power and all our negotiating skills to gain maximum advantage from the WTO. At the same time, we have to speed up our reform process so that our industry and agriculture can become more competitive. To discuss more WTO-related issues in the Indian economy, we will meet again next Monday.